What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2013 Volkswagen Golf Mk6 TDI. Today on the TDI behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your engine's thermostat. This will be applicable to your 2009 to 2014 2-liter TDI motors. Now, typically we recommend you do this service whenever you do your timing belt and water pump, as in most cars you would always service the water pump and thermostat together. The only caveat being here is that the thermostat isn't really near the water pump and belt service, so people tend to overlook that. We just performed that DIY on the car behind us, so stay tuned for that video. But while we have the car here, we're going to go ahead and swap out the thermostat as well. That vehicle is at 102,000 miles. And the owner, Pat, believes that the thermostat is stuck open. The reason being is it does not get to temp. Even on a hot 95-degree day, it will not reach operating temp. So what that means is that the internal thermostat on his car has gotten stuck open. The alternative, which is not great, is if the thermostat gets stuck closed, then your car will overheat. It won't cool properly. So just look out for that if you're thinking that you may have a thermostat issue. But 100,000 miles is usually a good interval, or whenever you do your timing belt and water pump. With the thermostat, we have a couple seals that we'll also be replacing, and we also recommend you get some coolant. This is some concentrate coolant, which we will dilute with distilled water. But before we get started on this DIY, let's take a look at some of the tools you're going to need for this job. For this job, you're going to need a ratchet. We are using both a 1/4 inch and 3/8 drive, as well as a torque wrench. That's going to be for the thermostat bolts, if we can get to them. We have a couple different set of extensions. We may have to dive in for some more, or some swivel sockets. These pliers are designed for the constant pressure clamps that this car is equipped with. A magnet tool. We have a small hook tool. This will help with some of the intake piping. Flathead screwdriver is always handy, as well as a small pick. We're also using CTA flexible screwdrivers. These have hex heads on them. This is a 7mm, which I'll be using for hose clamps. Small pry bar. Some pliers if you need to pry something out of the way or get some of the electrical harnesses out of the way. A huge key important tool for this DIY is going to be a stubby M8 triple square bit. This came out of our Astro tool set, which is Astro 9448. Has a bunch of different tiny bits as well as security bits, but paired with a small gear wrench ratcheting ratchet, that's going to be the sweet spot, I believe. We also have a regular M8 if we don't need that. We have an M10 and M12, two different size 10mm sockets, one for our small ratchet, one for our large one, a T30 and a T25. Electrical tools always make the job a little bit easier. Brake clean for cleanup, a small Scotch-Brite pad, some green stuff for cleaning the block once you get the thermostat out. We're going to be using a vacuum fill tool for our cooling system, which is also linked in the description below, but you can fill it up the traditional method. And not pictured here, but needed, is going to be a catch pan for your coolant. Now with that, my good people, let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we are under the hood of the Mk6. Now, it's very important that you do this job with a nice, cool engine. You don't want it to be at temp or hot or anything like that. So if you need to let it sit down overnight, put a fan on it, whatever you need to do to make sure it's cold. First thing we're going to do is drain the coolant system. In order to do that, we're going to go ahead and break the vacuum seal by removing the cap on our expansion tank. And while we're up here, we can also go ahead and remove our insulation cover. These just pop up. And now with that, we're going to hop underneath the Mk6, remove our skid shield, and drain some coolant. To get to our coolant hose, which we're going to be draining from, if your vehicle is still equipped with it, you're going to want to remove your splash shield. It's held in by 9 T25s and 3 T30s along the back. We're going to start with the T25s first, as the shield is kind of held in via the front still, and then we'll tackle the last 3 T30s at the back last. Just be mindful, sometimes there's debris up here, rocks, dirt, fluids, so avoid spilling any of that on your face if you're working on the ground especially. So let's get this off. All right, now that we have our shield off, we have access to some of the coolant lines up front. So let's grab our pliers, remove a clamp, and we'll drain some coolant. All right, so now we're going to drain from this lower radiator hose here, or this lower coolant line. First, we're going to loosen it from this plastic clamp here. Small flathead screwdriver will do the trick. It's just an alligator clip. That'll allow us to swing it down once we unclamp it up top. And then we have a hose clamp up top, which we're gonna undo. We can use some pliers. We have our hose clamp pliers handy, so we'll use these to get the clamp off. Now the goal is gonna be to break the seal on the hose between the connector here. So if you can, give it a twist or get a small pick or something that just won't penetrate or poke a hole in the hose and break that seal. Now this won't get all the coolant out. Once we pull the part out, there might still be some more coolant in the system, so make sure you have a catch pan under the car once we get to that point. But for now, this will help get some of the coolant out of the system. All right, and with that, that's all we're gonna get out of here. We can go ahead and reinstall our hose once more, situate the clamp on, and then head it back up top. Once you have your hose situated all the way back up, then you can reinstall your clamp once more. Make sure you leave it in a position where it's easy to access should you need to get to it again. All right, and then we'll secure it back with the alligator clip. All right, with that situated, let's head back up top. All right, now that we've drained our coolant back up top, we're gonna work on removing some items to get easier access to our thermostat, starting with this intake tube here, or that goes to our air box, I should say. Just gonna pop it off by pulling it off to the side, and take that top cover off, and then just wiggle it out from the bottom of the air box. All right, once you have your elbow out of the way, you'll notice our car may have some vacuum lines that yours doesn't, and that's because we've done the update on the intercooler for the icing problem. So if your car has these vacuum lines, we're just gonna go ahead and move them off to the side for the time being. We're gonna disconnect the electrical connector, go into our flap actuator here, part of our quote unquote throttle body. Pull that off, set it to the side. And now with that, we're gonna switch over to our triple square bits and work on removing this EGR pipe from the flapper. So let's go ahead and do that now. We have two M10 triple squares to remove. And then we can swing this off just a bit. We don't want to bend it too much, so that will do for now. We have our clamp at the bottom. This is where the flexible screwdriver really comes into play. Super easy. Get that on there and just undo our clamp. You could also argue that a small, short, stubby flathead will also do the trick, or a 7mm on a 1/4" ratchet. All right, that should be more than loose enough. Now we can go ahead and pull this intake elbow out. All right, now we have our EGR pipe undone and we have our electrical connector up here undone. The next step for us is going to be to pull out the fans to give us room to remove our intake elbow and also give us some more working room on this car. So next we're going to remove this top portion of our airbox duct. We have two T25s, one on either side of the ducting. And we have two T30s up top that hold our fan assembly to our radiator. And we have two more at the bottom as well, which we'll get after. Driver's side T30s under the upper radiator hose. Now let's head underneath to remove the bottom two and our electrical connector. All right, down below we have an electrical connector to undo. We have a red tab that we want to unlock first. Using a small flathead screwdriver or small pick, press that back like that. And then you're going to press on the red tab itself to disconnect the electrical connector. I'm going to use the flathead to help me out here. What we can also do is pull the electrical connector housing out. Just a little bit more room to work with as far as accessing that tab. There we go. And with that connector out of the way and the harness end out of the way, we have access to the T30 right above the intercooler line that we can undo next. And we have one more on the passenger side. And the last T30 on the passenger side resides behind the coolant line that we undid earlier to drain our coolant. Now we have that situated, we can head back up top. Now we're going to work on pulling our fan out. Tilting it 90 degrees, or rotating it 90 degrees, I mean, is going to be the way to pull these out without undoing the radiator hoses. Should you want to undo those, mainly the upper one to give you more room, then you can certainly do that as well. Well, you can also drop the fan out the bottom, straight down. Normally we pull them out the top here, but out the bottom gives you plenty of room as well. So for those of you following along at home, just make sure the fan doesn't fall on you. All right, let me set that to the side and then we'll proceed. Now we can work on removing our intake elbow. Again, ours may look a little bit different to yours, as we have the updated version that has the temp switch with a few vacuum lines coming out of it. So the hardware size may change on the clamp. For us, we're going to use a 7mm CTA flexible screwdriver to undo the clamps. You can also use a small flathead screwdriver. I'm just going to use the CTA flexible screwdriver. This is a 7mm driver to undo this upper clamp. Now again, this elbow on our vehicle is going to look a little bit different, as it has a built-in temp switch for the new updated intercooler. So we have a couple vacuum lines running off of it. Yours may look a little bit different if you have the factory one, and or the clamp size head might change as well. So just keep that in mind. Now with that, we're going to reach down below and get the bottom clamp. Then we'll reach down below to get the bottom clamp. This is where this flexible screwdriver really comes in handy. All right, and now we can wrestle this elbow off. These can be a pain in the butt, so don't be surprised if you have a little bit of a hard time taking them off. Just gonna use this flathead screwdriver to break this seal and pry this elbow down a bit. It's pretty thick rubber. We're not gonna hurt anything by doing this. Now for us, we're going to disconnect the lower vacuum line only, and we'll just swing the elbow up and over. Now we have our elbow off, we're going to work on removing this first portion of our throttle body, flapper body, call it what you like, before our EGR pipe there, or EGR valve. So let's grab our quarter inch ratchet. We have a small 10mm nut that holds the dipstick to the valve first, so we're going to take that off, and then we'll switch over and get the 3 bolts that hold this actuator in place. Before we get too carried away with doing more work, make sure you block off the lower portion of the piping going into your intercooler. Use some shop towel, you can use a glove, rubber band and a Ziploc, anything just to keep any debris from falling in there. I'm just going to use a shop towel to block this up in case anything should fall in there. And then we'll be able to just pull it out. Now we have 3 T30s that hold this portion of the valve in place. We have one up front here, so let's get that one first. Then we have one more to the right on the driver's side of things, which we're going to get to now. Same type of bolt as the top one. Our third bolt changes a little bit. It's a different style head, but still a T30. And we can pop this down. This is a great time to inspect the valve, see if there's any carbon buildup. We'll inspect the next one as well when we pull that off. Clean it up as best as you can. Just be mindful of the electrical connector. But for now, we're going to set this to the side, and let's move on with the next piece. Next one is right behind where the EGR pipe goes. Now we should be able to pull this off as well. And we have an electrical connector on the side of it, which we want to clear. Here's where all the good gunky buildup is. Just rotate it so you can access the electrical connector. Same deal. You have a tab, something else to push in and then push out. We use a little flathead screwdriver to help us just get it started. There we go. And same deal with this on your EGR valve. Just clean out any debris that you can, any buildup. so that way it flows a little bit better when you put it all back together. But for now, we're going to go ahead and set this to the side. Keep the hardware with it if you can that you just pulled off. And now, let's continue on. One of the next things we're going to work on, my good people, is accessing the M10 bolt behind the oil filter housing. That one holds a hard plastic line that goes into the side of our thermostat. Without removing that bolt that holds that line in place, we won't have any room to separate it from the thermostat. So it's going to be a little bit tedious as it's right behind the oil filter housing gasket, or right behind the oil filter housing itself. We have a new seal for that line, which we'll show you how to replace. So accessing that bolt will allow us to remove it and pry the line out once we undo the two 10mm bolts that hold our thermostat in place. So we'll tackle the really hard bolt first, and then we'll access the other two bolts after as a reward. They're all going to be a little bit tight, but let's get to it. So we have a grommet up here on top of this bracket that we're just going to pinch. It's the end of a little clip that holds our harness in place. You can also just cut the zip tie going to the harness, whichever one you want to do. You can always replace the zip tie too. But if we can just pop this out, it might make life a little bit easier for us. Like I said, we're going to be replacing the zip tie, so no problem there. Now that will allow us to pull this harness up out of the way so we can access that triple square bolt back there. To get that triple square out, we're going to use an M8. You're going to need some sort of stubby. You may be able to get a flexible driver in there, but we're using this little gear wrench tool like we mentioned at the beginning. It's just a little toolkit with an M8 to get that out. It's nice and stubby. It should be enough to break it free. It's ratcheting, so it should make life a little bit easier. So right now a flathead is our tool of choice to just spin that bolt out the rest of the way. My hands are way too big to get in there, but this is doing the trick. Might be a little bit tricky to get it back in, but we'll worry about that once we get to that point. Let's put a magnet tool on it, see if we got it out enough that we can pull it out. Between the flathead screwdriver and the magnet tool, we were able to wiggle this M8 out. The reinstall of this might be a different story, but for now, let's reward ourselves with some more easier task. Let's undo some clamps from our thermostat and proceed from there. We're going to take our hose clamp pliers and undo some clamps. Starting with this top one that goes to our thermostat. Again, these are all going to the thermostat now. Let's rotate this tool a little bit. Okay, then we can move this hose clamp back. Be prepared for more coolant to spill out. So have a catch pan underneath ready to go. With the clamp off, now we can work on removing the hose. Might have to twist it a bit, work it off the thermostat. Just gonna tuck this up out of the way. To the left of the dipstick, we have one more clamp right here. Pretty straightforward, same deal. Here we go. Just to give you a better view of how we're using this plier tool, the circular end goes on the small tab, and then the other end bites the clamp like so. I'm going to rotate this one now so we don't forget. And we will just let this one hang off to the side. Last but not least, we have this giant clamp right here. Same thing. That one goes to our hose that we drained earlier. We're going to go ahead and remove that as well. Right now, I just use some regular needle nose pliers to rotate that clamp a bit. I couldn't really get enough bite to remove it, but I was able to rotate the clamp to a position where I can use the proper tool now. And now we'll just pull the hose off. You can also see the connection down below where that hard line joins our thermostat. That's what we're going to be prying on. from where we removed that bolt to separate those a bit. We can give it a little pry now while it's still bolted to the block, just to break the initial seal, and then we'll work it off some more once we get the two 10mm bolts off that hold the thermostat in place. So to show you what this will look like when we pry a bit on the hose, that's going to separate that just a bit. And then to show you where we're prying from, we're over on the right side of the oil filter housing. I'm just using a pry bar. You can use a long screwdriver. And I'm getting on the inside of that tab and just prying super gently, not trying to break the hose, not trying to break the tab. So with that, the next thing we're going to do is work on removing this bracket. That's just going to give us a little bit more room to work with when we pull this thermostat out. And it will allow our dipstick to move around a little bit more. You definitely don't want to remove it. You can, but then you're going to have to block the port down below so you don't get any coolant into your oil pan. But for us, this should be fine, just a little bit of wiggle room. So let's grab a triple square and get this bracket off. Just a quick correction, my good people. It is an M12 that holds the bottom of this bracket in place. I'm using a long extension. We're going to try our best to get a good bite on that bolt, and then we'll crack it free and remove it. All right. We'll take this bracket out. That just gives us a little bit more wiggle room to work with our thermostat. Now we're going to grab a 10mm socket, and the top bolt is really easy to get to. The bottom bolt is going to be the tricky one. We'll try to remove it without disturbing the alternator, and if we need to move the alternator, then we will. So let's get ready for that. So for these, my good people, the M8 bit that we used at the beginning for that tough to reach bolt fits perfectly inside these 10mm bolts, as it still has a triple square head inside of it. So we're going to use that same one for this bottom one. I believe we have broken the bolts loose, at least cracked it free. Now we will go in and attempt our screwdriver trick. Almost, my good people. The problem is you run out of room for the sockets and the swivel at the same time. So if you move the alternator body, sure, no problem. So this is worth a quick check, but we'll stick to our screwdriver and magnet trick. All right, that feels nice and loose. Heck yeah, my good people. Now we can tackle the top one, which is arguably way easier to get to. This one we may even be able to get a ratchet on. Let's give it a try. We'll fish it out. And now becomes the ballet that is pulling out the thermostat. And then we can pull the thermostat out. Be mindful of the dipstick. What I'm going to do is pull this 10mm bolt down below, just to give ourselves just a little bit more room so we don't have to flex the dipstick too much. And here is this sucker that causes so many pinched fingers. Let's go ahead and clean up our block and get ready to install our new thermostat. Now, next what we're going to do is clean the block with some green Scotch-Brite pad, just get some of that oxidation off, giving our new thermostat and seal a better chance at going in. We'll also be replacing the O-ring seal on that plastic pipe before we install the new thermostat. We'll lube both of them up, make our life a little bit easier. So let's clean up our block. Goal here is just to get some of the oxidation off. We're not trying to resurface the metal here or get any debris inside of our cooling passages. While I have you here, my good people, we're going to go ahead and pull this old O-ring off. Highly recommend you replace this, especially if it's the first time you're doing this job, so everything's original. You don't want to have a leak at the thermostat after this annoying DIY. Make sure the O-ring goes all the way back on the groove so that the tip of the pipe is exposed. At this point, we're going to take a little bit of dielectric grease and lube up our O-ring. You can also use a little bit of coolant. Just be sure if you use something like dielectric grease or something similar that you don't contaminate the area too much. You don't want to get it on the inside the cooling system. All right, with that O-ring is good to go. We're also gonna lube up the O-ring on the back of our thermostat housing. Same thing, we're not trying to do a Picasso here. We're just working on getting this seal nice and coated so that it has a easier chance at going into the block. So whatever you do, make sure you don't get anything on the face here or the opening. And if you do, just wipe it away. All right, and then we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna be prying our pipe back, kind of fitting our thermostat on at an angle. Once we have it on the pipe, then we can worry about situating it inside the block. Oh yeah, so you can see the pipe is starting there. And while we do that, we're still prying a little bit, also lining up the thermostat over on the block. Oh yeah, my good people. Now I'm just gonna wiggle the thermostat back and forth a bit until it fully seats itself in. If you've done a water pump on these cars, it's the same feeling. You wanna feel that seal pop in. You don't wanna let it get pinched or bind up. And right now what I'm looking for is just making sure that the thermostat doesn't look weird. It's not cocked into a weird position. And so far it looks pretty good. I think we have the seal on in at least 80% of the way. So the two 10mm bolts will get it in the rest of the way. So we're just gonna double check our work and then we'll pick it back up with our two 10mm bolts / M8s. These two 10mm bolts get torqued down to 9 Newton meters. Since we can't really get a torque wrench on these, we're just gonna do our best to snug them up. So as you can imagine, 9 Newton meters is not a whole lot, so don't go gorilla on them, just snug them up gently. All right, now we can switch over to our stubby once more, snug up the bottom, snug up the top, and do our best to simulate 9 Newton meters with the old calibrated wrist. Now we're gonna get in here with our stubby once more. Snug up the bottom, then we'll snug up the top. Again, using the calibrated wrist to simulate 9 Newton meters, so not a whole lot, my good people. Don't go crazy torquing this down, but also don't leave it too loose. Last thing you want is a leak. I cannot stress enough how much the stubby M8 is the move here. All right, my good people, I got a really good bite on the bottom bolt. We're gonna pull our tool out, and now we're gonna situate the top. All right, now we have the bottom 10 and the top 10 tightened up. Our next step is gonna be to secure the bolt that holds the plastic pipe in place. Once we're happy with that and that's all situated, then we can add on the other hoses and resecure our dipstick. But for now, we just want to make sure that the most tedious things that we won't be able to get to easy, if we need to go back to anything, are all situated. So now we're going to go ahead and tackle the M8 that holds the coolant pipe in place. This is how I'm going to feed it in with a magnet tool. I just wanted to get stuck in the threads, and then we'll go in with our screwdriver and snug it up, and then we'll go in with the stubby. I'm going to go in with my screwdriver. We want to snug this up as best as we can so we don't have to fight the ratchet when it comes time to tightening it down. I'm also not trying to ruin the triple square bolt. All right. Don't forget to resecure your harness once more. We'll get a new zip tie and zip tie that back up. Now we're going to go ahead and feed our 10mm bolt back in at the bottom that holds our dipstick in place. Now we're going to start with the bottom coolant hose first. Get that one back on. There's the bottom hose. Now we can feed our coolant expansion tank hose back on. Now we're going to go ahead and install our upper hose. Feed that on until it stops. Get our clamp close. And situate that back on. We're going to get it right on the original marks. Put it somewhere we can work with it next time if we need to get to it, or the next person that gets to it. Now we're going to work on installing our bracket. We pulled off the bottom hose real quick just so we can see a little bit better. See where we're working with. And this is an M12 bolt. Now we can reinstall our lower coolant hose once more. Again, we just popped it off to get a better view of the bolt hole where that bracket bolt went in. If you are better than me, which you are, you would have put that bracket on already before the hoses. Now our clamp back in its home. Now we can install our EGR valve. We have our EGR valve. We cleaned up a lot of the carbon buildup inside of it, so that's good to rock and roll. We have a new gasket for this, which we have linked in the description below. I know it wasn't on the table when we first started, but sometimes we come across things that Mike doesn't always think about, but lucky for you, this will already be linked down there for you. So if you need to grab one, I would highly recommend you replace it. These do get flat after a while. We have our old one off, and we have our new one. It has a little tab that keys it. There's also a flat spot on it and a little tab that keys it in, so it only goes in one way. And for our EGR tube here, we're going to pull off this old gasket. Should just come straight off. Scotch-Brite some of this old gasket material off. All right, and same thing for that. We have a new metal gasket, which we will be applying. So first we'll start with our EGR. We're going to get it nice and close. We also have our electrical connector, which we can't forget about. And we'll go ahead and plug that in now. That's this white connector. And then we're just going to snug them up by hand using our T30 and our 1/4" ratchet. We're going to torque them down no more than 8 Newton meters on these. We're just going to snug them up using the old calibrated wrist. Not a whole lot of force for these two little T30s. All right. Next we have our flapper valve. This is responsible for helping stop the engine so we don't have a runaway diesel here, which can happen to any diesel. We're going to go ahead and remember that the longest bolt with the rounded head goes at the bottom. And then we have the two shorter T30s top and on the side. So pull these out for now. And with that, we can go ahead and feed our EGR valve in. We have our white electrical connector here that we're going to want to reattach. And right now we're just going to move this so that it's easy to get that connector on. Then we'll grab our two T30s, get those started by hand. And then we'll just grab our T30 on our 1/4" ratchet and snug both of those up. No more than 8 or 9 Newton meters if you're going to torque them down. Once they're tight, maybe 1/8 of a turn, and we're good to rock. Now we can install our flapper valve. Same thing, we have a gasket on this one that we're going to want to replace. We can take out this old flat one. We also went ahead and cleaned the inside with a little bit of brake clean on a towel. You can pick this old gasket out. These get flat over time, and this one's 10 years old, so we're definitely going to replace it. Now we'll grab our new one. And these go on whichever way you like. It's a flat gasket. Key is into the valve here. This is responsible for keeping the engine from becoming a runaway diesel. We'll cut the air off and save it, which can happen to any diesel. So Kind of cool. We're gonna go ahead and orientate this like so. Remember, this tab here is for the dipstick for the 10mm bolt. We have the two shorter T30s and then the really long T30. We're gonna sandwich this between the EGR valve and our bracket down below. We'll just get all three started first before we snug any of them down. We'll line up the very long T30 next. And same deal, my good people, we're gonna snug up the three T30s. All right, we'll reinstall our 10mm bolt. This is gonna secure our dipstick up top. We can reinstall our EGR. We have a new metal gasket for that, for our EGR tube. These are M10s. We're just gonna start them by hand first. Make sure that we got the gasket locked in properly. We can pull our towel out or whatever you use to block your intake pipe down below. You can see how nasty that is from above. I made a nice seal, kept everything free and clear, which means now we can swing this over. We can bring our vacuum line over once more. Spray a little bit of brake clean on the hose here. It'll act like a lubricant, but then it'll also dissipate, so it's not gonna stay in the system. It's not gonna hurt anything. Now we're just fighting to get the elbow up on the top half here. It's gonna be a little bit tedious. Matter of working the elbow back and forth, not getting it to fold up on the flapper valve. That is what I'm fighting right now. There we go, baby. And we are on. All right, I'm gonna double check that my clamps are in a good spot, and then we're gonna go ahead and tighten both the bottom one and the top one. Now using a flathead or a 7mm bit, tighten the top clamp. We made sure that our clamp is in a good spot. It's gonna hug the neck of the flapper valve assembly just right. So we get a nice tight seal. Oh yeah. Now I'm just gonna reach down below and do the bottom one. We can reinstall our vacuum line that we undid going to the intercooler once more. Excellent, now we have that situated. Let's reinstall our fan once more. And we can plug this connector in now. All right, let's reinstall our fans. We're gonna feed our fan back in. This time we'll feed it in from the top. You can feed it in from the bottom if that's how you took it out, like we may or may have not accidentally done. All right, we wanted to sit nice and flush. We'll situate it with the two T30s up top first. All right, with these two situated, let's head down below and do our bottom two T30s and our electrical connector. Then we can swing our electrical connector over. There we go, lock in the red tab. Now let's hop over to the passenger side for the final T30. Now we're gonna install the last T30 right behind this coolant line, and honestly, AC line is probably the one I have the most beef with out of all the lines in this car. It's always in the way. And with that, now we can reinstall our skid plate. Right now at this point, we can go ahead and reinstall our splash shield. Make sure that the front keys in properly. You have one tab that should be down below for one of the T25s. And we'll start with the T30s in the back first so that it can hold up our shield. Then we can work our way around with the T25s. Now our car is missing a few of the T25s, so we'll make sure to install the ones we have by hand. And we'll wrap it up with the 2 T30s in the back. All right, now with that, let's hop back up top of things and wrap up this DIY. All right, back up top, we have 2 more things to install before we put our cover on and fill it with coolant. We have this ducting that goes up on our core support here. We have a T25, one on either side, that holds this into place. Sorry for the hand, just gonna get this started and we'll show you what that looks like. We have one more on the other side. Pop this cover off. We're gonna reinstall this truly incredibly tight fit elbow. Never seen anything quite like it before. Now we can put our beauty cover back on. And now, this is my favorite part. We can go ahead and fill this up with some coolant. All right, so at this point, my good people, like we said, we're gonna be using the vacuum fill tool to fill our coolant. Otherwise, you can just fill the reservoir, run the car, heat on high, and let it self-bleed as you top it off. We have our airline set up with our compressor. I've done this with a regular 20-gallon compressor at home, works great. We have shop air today. If you haven't seen us use this tool before, our goal is to pull vacuum up until the 25 mark on the gauge. Give it a few minutes. As long as that gauge does not move, then we know that we have no leaks in the system. And then we can go ahead and fill our vehicle with coolant. This end has to stay at the very bottom of our coolant bucket the whole time. If it sees any air, then this whole process is null. So keep this submerged at all times. If you need to close the valve to add more coolant to the system, go ahead and do that. We have 2 gallons in our bucket, so we should have more than enough. Now, be mindful of your paint. Pat told me he hates the paint on this car, so we're not too worried about scratching the front bumper here, but if you have a car with nice paint, just be very careful. All right, now we're gonna pull vacuum. It's completely normal, if you can see them, to see the coolant lines collapse on your vehicle. So don't be alarmed, that is exactly what you wanna see. Right now we're at the 25 on our gauge. We're gonna give it a few minutes, we'll come back in a sec, and then we'll fill it with some coolant. All right, it's been a few minutes. We have our hose submerged at the very bottom of our coolant tank. What I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna open the valve for a sec and prime the system. I'm gonna close it back up. And this is a little bit overkill at this point, but I'm just gonna pull a little bit more vacuum to account for what was in the line here. And now we can go ahead and open the valve, keep an eye on our coolant level, and wait until it completely stops pulling coolant. Right at this point, our system is done doing its magic trick. You can go ahead and lose the airline. If you need to, go ahead and adjust the level on your expansion tank, either by pulling out some or adding some, but usually the tool leaves it at a pretty good spot. For now, my good people, all we have left to do today is put this cap back on. And now with our cooling system filled up, my good people, that is going to conclude this DIY for today. Honestly, the stubby MA is going to be your best friend as far as tools are concerned for this DIY. There's truly no other way to do it unless you go into service mode and you want to pull the clip off or you want to pull the alternator out and get crazy with it. If you're doing another DIY while you're in there, might as well go ahead and do that. But for us today, that was the way to do it. No service mode needed. I highly, highly, highly recommend you pull the fan out. Gives you a lot more room to work with. If you like this DIY, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment section below. And if you like this video and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.